All right, so we got him right here, King County Executive Dow Constantine. We've been trying to catch up with him for a minute. Busy schedules. Finally landed the interview, and I appreciate you joining us right here on the Morning Update Show. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Can you tell people here in King County what is the current state of COVID? I mean, there's lots of messaging going back and forth. What are the most important things that people should know about where we're at with COVID and what people should be doing?
Well, as you might recall, we were the first place in the nation to have an outbreak of coronavirus, and we jumped on it. We asked people to stay at home, to wash their hands, to do all the things, and they did. And that allowed us to escape the kind of situation we saw in New York, and now we're seeing in Texas, Florida, and other places. But people, have been letting down the guard a little bit, and it's been creeping back. We were down to 10, 20, 30 cases a day. Now we're at 150, 200 or more per day. And we're trying to keep a lid on that. And it is a tremendous challenge because we also want people to be able to earn a living, to do the things they need to do to keep their lives moving. We are concerned that people have to really be reminded to protect themselves, to protect their loved ones, to protect the entire community by avoiding unnecessary contacts, by wearing a mask, washing your hands, never going out when you're sick. And it is a particular challenge because there's a lot of disproportionality, I guess, as you might expect, in who's being infected. And that is something that I really want to convey today. African Americans or Black residents of our county are about 6.5%, but 12% of the infections. And it's even worse in the Hispanic Latino community, where it's about 10% of the population, but more than 27% of the new infections. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the bottom line is we need credible messengers to really be communicating with everyone about how to prevent infection, about how serious this is, both for young people who can suffer some significant and potentially lifelong consequences, but particularly for those who are older or have compromised immune systems. And we need to improve access to testing. And this has just been an absolute debacle on the part of the federal government. The failure to provide adequate testing, the mistakes right out of the gate, and still now 5 months later, inadequate resources, inadequate supplies for testing to happen wherever it needs to happen in the community. It is an abysmal failure by our national government, and it is something that we just cannot allow to ever be repeated.
I talked to the health department yesterday, and they were talking about South King County is a hot spot. And I mean, there might be a few different reasons why, but I think one of the reasons that we discussed is that, a lot of the people who are essential workers, people who are going to work every day, are living south of the Seattle city limits. What kind of, are you guys, is the county taking any other special precautions or special efforts to address the issues there in South King County?
So we've been working very hard to push more messaging, more PPE, that is the protective equipment, more testing and testing capacity into South King County and South Seattle, where we're seeing an increase in infections. And you're absolutely right. I mean, part of the reason that there is a disproportionality in infection is because essential workers, the people who have to go out there and provide the services and make the community run, and people who need to get out there and earn a living to keep a roof over their heads, are disproportionately Black and Latino. And so they're going to be more likely to be exposed to infection. Also, Black and Latino households on average are bigger. They're multi-generational households. And the infections between kids and adults, or adults and seniors, is more likely under those circumstances. A lot of household infections are happening. And then people with underlying health conditions are more vulnerable. And because of social determinants of health, there are certain chronic health conditions that are more prevalent in the African American community and can make people more susceptible to more dire consequences from infection.
Right, right. So moving along, it's protest season. We're going we're closing in on month number 2. Just some of your thoughts on what's occurring here in Seattle, across King County, but specifically right here in the city. We hear a lot from the mayor, of course, and police chief and different city council members. But you have a wider view. Of course, you have the view of the county, and maybe you can share with us some of your thoughts as to what you're seeing out here in the streets in Seattle, and what role the county might play in that.
Well, in many ways, it's a tremendously exciting moment. I mean, I'm old enough to be able to remember in the late 1960s when people took to the streets demanding change. And that change didn't really ever come. And I don't want that to happen again. I mean, I was not an adult then, but I do think that the shared beliefs in the country are different now, that people are responding differently to this movement, and that there is an opportunity to use this moment to catalyze genuine change if we don't allow the window to close. Right? We gotta act. So the protests, the voicing of the deep grief and concern about the role of racism in the history of this nation and in its present institutions is something that can be a springboard for us to accomplish change that is needed to happen forever. And so that is a good thing, and we should all make sure that the message doesn't get hijacked by a few people who have their own agendas, many of whom are white and have ideologies that are not necessarily aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement. I am excited because I went into politics to try to create change, and now suddenly things have been shaken up by COVID, by economic collapse, by this awakening among more than African Americans, among people across this country and across this community who are saying, oh, damn, there is a chance here to really make change. And I had managed to somehow, the public had managed to somehow kind of assume that the world was just going to automatically and gradually get better, which it clearly is not. So I'm optimistic. I think that we have to capitalize on this moment, and there's some things that we're able to do. We'll talk about detention, I think, and other things in a minute, but on policing and community safety, we're beginning the process of diving into really a community-based model, particularly in urban unincorporated King County. And I don't know what that's going to look like yet, but I've been working with Councilmember Zahalai, who's going out and doing some public hearings. I've talked with the sheriff very seriously about the need to be able to be open to change and engage that conversation fully. And I think it can happen. The same thing with transit police. Transit police are King County sheriffs, and that's true on both Metro and Sound Transit. And both for fare enforcement, which is privately contracted, and the police, which is contracted from a public agency, I think there's an opportunity to really dramatically transform that system along the same lines. And finally, we declared, we're the public health agency, declared that racism is a public health crisis. And we're gathering community members to help us really develop what the action agenda should be around that, not a mere declaration, but a set of actions that can respond to it in a way that comes from a public health perspective, that is based on data, that is based on seeking better outcomes. And that has been an effective tool for us in approaching some other challenges, including gun violence and reducing the prevalence of youth detention.
What were your thoughts of Saturday's actions here? We're up here on Capitol Hill on in regards to maybe that small majority that you're talking about, and then also the police, the Seattle police response, and then later on that night, the King County Sheriff reinforced the police as well as the Washington State Patrol. So, as a macro view, as the county executive. If you can kind of give us your overall thoughts from Saturday.
Yeah. Well, I think, in general, and I know it's become just a cliche now, but almost everybody protested peacefully and in a way that was heartfelt and productive. And some people decided to commit acts of violence, people breaking into small businesses and causing harm that is not on message. I did see that the King County Sheriff provided mutual support when it was requested. That was we had asked that afternoon whether they were going to be backing up Seattle Police and told no. So I have yet to get an answer as to what changed, like what condition. I don't know if it was the Seattle Police declaring a riot or what the thing is. As you probably are aware, under the current system anyway, I don't run the sheriff's office, so they're a separate agency with a separate elected official in charge of them. But we have supported a charter amendment that the King County Council has placed on the ballot to make the sheriff an appointed position, so that then there would be accountability and more opportunity to control the policies of the sheriff's office. I do think that the protests in the streets need to continue. I want people to be safe, harking back to our conversation about COVID. I've been out to protests, I know many others have, and it needs to be a conversation in this moment that is led by Black voices and not as well-meaning as white allies are, not hijacked entirely by white people.
Right. And I'll wait this to the last segment, to our last question, which is about the youth jail. But of course, the youth jail was caught on fire on Saturday. Next question is Charleena Lyles, and this was an interesting turn of events that occurred right here on Converge, in that we had the Seattle Police Officers Guild, Mike Solon, and a few other officers on. And the conversation, it wasn't about any specific case, because a lot of times, you go on TV, police can't talk about cases, and so you just kind of waste your time asking the question. And we knew that we couldn't talk about specific cases that were open and things like that. And so broader discussion about mental health, and about maybe that's a place where the Seattle Police Department and the community might see kind of eye to eye. And that the SPD said 17,000 calls last year were mental health. And, they're like, hey, we're not necessarily suited for it. And the community is like, hey, why are the police responding to mental health? But during that conversation, Solon had brought what he said is that Charleena Lyles was suicide by cop. And so, of course, at that point, we needed to bring Charleena's, family on. And so we brought on Katrina, her cousin. And what Katrina said was that there is no final determination in this case or a lot of other cases, because the inquest process has been stopped. And, when I asked her, I said, okay, well, man, who's in charge of the inquest process? Let's go talk to them. And she said that it was you. And, right away, I was like, hey, Executive Constantine, what's the story? And that's kind of how we've ended up right here on this interview. Although we talked about a bunch of other topics, our interview today really started out of that conversation about Charleena Lyles. And so maybe you can tell us what is going on with the inquest process, maybe how it works briefly, and what's going on with it, and when will these inquests move forward so people can get a final determination as to the police shootings.
So the inquest is the medical examiner's inquest. So it's essentially the coroner's report. And fundamentally, it is designed to just ask who, what, when, where, and what we want to find out is why. And previously it was conducted by the district court, even though they were doing it just voluntarily. It's not part of their duties. And the case was presented by the county prosecutor. Families came to us. There was an upsurge in police-involved deaths a couple of years ago, and families came to us and said they didn't have faith in the outcome of these proceedings. And I guess if I can just distill down the real problem that was happening is like the officer that was involved was always being asked, did you fear for your life? And the answer, of course, was always yes. And then the press would take that and report, well, it's justified because the officer feared for his or her life. But that's not actually the standard, right? And especially now with the adoption of the new law, is supposed to be what a reasonable officer based on training would do. And what we wanted the question to be is not, did you subjectively fear for your life, possibly because of the deep-seated biases that we all carry around with us, and I mean we all carry around with us, but was your action consistent with your training? Did this happen because your training was wrong, because the policies were wrong, or because what you did departed from what you were trained to do? And in either case, how can we get the agency then to fix that so the tragedy doesn't repeat itself as it has over and over and over again? And we went through with families and some representatives of police and created an entirely new process. A new process that involved not the prosecutor, but outside counsel and staff bringing the facts in. A process that involved hiring not the district court, but other presiding officers. A process that the families involved could have much more faith in because they helped create it, and that wouldn't lead to that misleading conclusion at the end about whether you feared for your life. And we were immediately, and I signed this into law as an executive order, sued by City of Auburn and Federal Way and Kent and Seattle and the King County Sheriff's Office. Like I said, I'm not the boss of them. And all of them to say that we were outside of our authority, that we shouldn't be asking these questions. And we are fighting that in court right now. We should have an answer within 20 days. Some of the families have also raised the issue of whether the jury in the case should be able to have a finding of some criminal liability or that a criminal act occurred. And that has historically, by case law, not been allowed in the state of Washington, but the court is being asked to review that. And so several of the families, some of whom are represented by our own public defense department, are asking for that. And that should all be available to us within a few weeks. And then I hope that people will not take this on appeal, but they'll allow us to proceed with the many inquests that need to happen so families can get some answers.
This inquest issue here, because my understanding is that, until the inquest is done, there is no final determination as to what happened there. And, I mean, for families and for police, it's just left open-ended.
Yeah. And it's, obviously terrible for the families to have to relive what happened to their loved one. We made it so that because the police officer always has the right to refuse to testify constitutionally, right, in case they're concerned about criminal liability. But we made it clear that their boss does have to show up. And of course, the bosses didn't like that either. So the police chief or the sheriff or whoever has to come and say, what was the training? Did this person follow the training? What were the facts that night, et cetera, et cetera? Because we need the agencies to start changing the way in which they approach this, to start training people to react differently, to start changing their policies about when deadly force is going to be used, or we're never going to see a change in the outcomes that are happening in the community.
All right. Last topic here is the youth jail and perhaps maybe the King County jail as well. Can you explain, because I think the average person, or at least a lot of people on the street, when they hear like, no new jail or people out of jail, it kind of sounds like you're letting just people out of jail. Is there another side of that, to where, you're trying to build up capacity on one end so people don't end up going to jail? Or is it like you're trying to close jails and let people out of jails?
Yeah, I mean, we've been steadily reducing detention at both the adult and youth levels over the course of the last couple of decades. And juvenile detention, just since I took office, we've been able to reduce from about 84 youth per day detained to about 20 this week. And just since mid-March, with the cooperation of the courts, prosecutor, the defender, and others, have been able to reduce from 43 to 19, 20, 21 the number of youth detained. It is an ongoing challenge because it starts with prevention and making sure that young people are getting the investments to be able to avoid the trap of getting involved in the criminal legal system. And that goes to the work we're doing through Best Starts for Kids, the work we're doing with community-based organizations, dozens of them, that are helping young people get off to a better start in life. But it also involves making sure we have ample capacity for diverting people, whether it's adults or youth, out of the system rather than having them go through the criminal legal system, providing alternatives if they're awaiting trial so they don't have to be detained. A judge will allow them to be with an organization like Choose 180 or Community Passageways that can surround them with mentoring and monitoring and keep them safe and keep the community safe. And as we reduce the number of, let's just talk about youth for a second, youth in detention, we're able to convert that space to other uses. Right now, one of the pods is being used for FERS, which is for youth whose families have been involved in domestic violence, and they're able to come and stay there safely and get counseling for themselves and the entire family to work through the situation. And we're going to be continuing to move more and more pods outside of the secure detention and into community uses. We have the toughest job we have to do with reducing youth detention further is to identify the strategies, to work with community and fund the strategies to allow young people who are there because the courts have sent them there because they're pending trial on very serious charges, to be outside of secure detention. I think we can do it. I don't know who else has actually done it successfully, but the fact that we've gone from originally hundreds to 84 to 20 youth in detention gives me the confidence to essentially challenge the community, including the elected officials, to make it happen.
Right. And so two things there. It's like, one, so I mean, this building costs $200 million, and then it's not done yet, but before it's done, they're saying that, you want to have it transformed, they repurpose it by 2025, and to be able to provide services.
Yeah. So remember, and this has been glossed over by lots of people, the building is an entire children and family center. It's got courts, it's got meeting rooms. Most of the work they do is around family issues, around foster placements. There's a criminal law element of it, but the detention portion is not the majority of the building. The thing that they burned down the trailers about the other day is a parking garage, right? So that's the part that's not done yet, but the building's done. Converting the detention portion has been part of the plan for many years now. I had them go back after it was approved in 2012 and redesign it so that the walls could be moved, the door could be moved, and space could be moved out of detention and into other uses, community uses to help kids get back on track in life, as we were able to do exactly what we're doing, which is one by one reduce the number of kids the courts feel compelled to order us to detain.
Right. And you said there's a drop in the number of youth that are being detained at the jail. Is that because there's a decrease in crime, because the police are just aren't arresting for people committing crimes, or these third-party programs and interventions that you talked about are working?
I mean, yes. I think the answer is yes. Over the long term, there has been a reduction in crime, even though, like the detention center we just tore down had 212 beds. It was built in 1953 when the county was one-third the size it is now. There has been a gradual reduction in the number of crimes being committed by youth. And we, in addition to that, have been getting much more cooperation from all the independent players in the system to figure out how to send kids to alternatives that are less traumatic and more likely to help them get their lives back on track and to keep the community safe, because everyone wants that as well. And that has to be part of what we all take responsibility for. If a young person is acting out, to try to figure out how we can help them come to terms with what they've done and to reconnect with their community that will help carry them through into adulthood, when people tend to get their lives together and be able to move on to be responsible members of the community.
Right. And so what are you saying to people who are, when you tweeted out, I guess it was last week, maybe the week before, like, hey, looking to close detention center by 2025. And a lot of people are like, close it now. So,
Right.
I mean, of course, I follow the protests. So, a lot of in the protests, it's like, why can't you close it now if that's the end goal? So for people who are on the side of the issue of they want this detention center, the detention part closed right away, why is it that there's a 5-year plan or 4
Again,
now?
I mean, first of all, I want to thank Black Lives Matter Seattle King County for demanding that it be closed, but also setting out the sort of commitment to help figure out how to deal with the genuine challenge that exists around kids who are committing serious and violent crimes against others. I'm not in charge of who gets to leave and who stays. That is very much the job of the judges. What I am doing is challenging them, saying that we are going to make the investments. Collectively, we're going to work to figure out how we can get to what I am declaring to be our community's commitment to not have centralized detention for young people. And there are going to have to be expectations put upon us, the defender, the prosecutor, the cops, and the courts to help make that happen along with the community. I want to just briefly, before our time's up, talk about adult detention, because we've been able to reduce gradually the number of adults detained. We have 2 major jails, one in downtown Seattle, one in Kent. The number was about 1,900 adults before COVID. We set about to reduce the occupancy to get people distanced so we could, as we have, prevent an outbreak of coronavirus in the jails. With the cooperation of all those players I mentioned, we were able to go from 1,900 to 1,300 adults in detention very quickly. So the challenge I've set out now is to stay at that number or below, and that when this crisis is over, the coronavirus crisis, to begin closing the downtown Seattle jail in phases and wheeling into a different way of approaching the challenge of the criminal legal system. I think we can do it. That building's going to have to close anyway. It was built in 1986. It is not a good design. It is not a good place. And all these players in the system who are saying, I never told them, actually know that. They know that we've been talking about how can we close down this building. So now it's time for them and the entire community to engage in conversation about how we do it safely.
I know we're up against the time, Executive Constantine, but if you had a minute or two to maybe share what your vision is, then, I mean, you said that, closing the jail and approaching a different way of dealing with criminal activity. Maybe you can share with us what that vision is.
Yeah. Well, first off, there are models around the world where countries, communities have figured out how to engage in a different way with people who violated community norms or broken the law or even committed violence against others. And we need to look to those and figure out how we can reduce the use of this sort of one-size-fits-all instrument of the cops, the prosecutor, the courts, to deal with a range of challenges. We talked about the way in which police are not always the answer when you're getting a call to someone who's having a behavioral health crisis, right? And the bad outcomes that leads to. Well, that is true of the entirety of the system. We have to find a way for the courts not to have to be the solution to everything, not to have to solve every single problem. Now, the answer is very similar to the one with youth. It is early investments to make sure people have opportunity, and if they have challenges in life, that we can help them get past those challenges. It is diversion into alternatives that help people get back on track. Yes, to be accountable for what they've done, but also to find a way to move forward with their life rather than just going to the jail, having a traumatic experience, getting sent back out with no resources, and getting back into the same old cycle. And I believe that everyone deep down understands that this is the right way to go, but people are sort of inherently resistant to change. That is how people are hardwired. So that's why, going back to our earlier conversation, a moment like this where we have multiple crises and awakenings converging is a really kind of a once in a lifetime chance to make this change. And we got to unite to be able to drive it forward. I think that this community has the resources to do it. So, whatever our differences or disagreements have been, we can carry those with us, but we got to figure out how to move this thing forward now.
All right, King County Executive Dow Constantine, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us, and I hope we'll get an opportunity to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Omari.